I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. This week, we have our monthly book club episode hosted by MJ Franklin. Our last one was about The Talented Mr. Ripley by Patricia Highsmith. That book is the basis for the absolutely killer 1999 film adaptation, as well as for the recent Netflix series starring Andrew Scott as the titular sociopath. This month, MJ gathers a group of editors to talk about My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante, which recently topped the Book Review's poll of great 21st century books. I'll let MJ take it away.
Hello, and welcome to another book club episode of the Book Review Podcast. I'm MJ Franklin. I'm an editor here at the New York Times Book Review, and for this month's book club, we're talking about My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. This felt like a natural book club selection for August because last month, the Book Review hosted a big project polling hundreds of literary luminaries about the best books of the 21st century so far, and the number one book was, you guessed it, My Brilliant Friend. And then we asked our readers, what do you think were the best books? And My Brilliant Friend came in at number 8. That is all to say, you love this book, so we decided to talk about it. And speaking of talking about it, I have in the studio with me a full house of expert readers that I'm excited to introduce. First, we have a familiar voice, a voice you know and love, Joumana Khatib. Joumana is a fellow editor here at the Book Review, a repeat book clubber. She was recently on our podcast to discuss summer reading. Welcome back, Joumana.
Thank you, MJ. Thanks for having me.
Also with us is Greg Cowles, another editor here at the Book Review. Greg does everything, but one notable thing that he does is he edits poetry column. And Greg, you were here last for our James book club discussion, correct?
That is correct.
Welcome back.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And last but not least, we have Emily Eakin, editor extraordinaire here at the Book Review, and she was last year for our good material discussion. Emily, welcome back.
Thank you for having me, MJ.
And now on to our book, My Brilliant Friend. My Brilliant Friend is the first book in Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan quartet. The series tracks the life and friendship of two girls from Naples, Leela and Lenù, who have a complicated friendship, sisterhood, rivalry, kinship, etc. They are intertwined souls. And also, I'm going to put a disclaimer here. We may mispronounce these characters' names. I have my own pronunciation in my head. I've been corrected, and I keep defaulting, so please bear with us. When the book opens, Leela has disappeared. In a panic, her son calls Lenù, asking for help. Lenù knows that Leela has always dreamt of disappearing and thinks, quote, Leela is overdoing it as always, and then we'll see who wins this time, and then sets out to write the story of their relationship. Then the book flashes back to the past, and we see their lives as it unfolds, and that is presumably the account that we're reading. As book one, My Brilliant Friend tracks their childhood and adolescence. We see how Leela and Lenù meet in the 50s as terrifically smart girls in a poor neighborhood. We see how they form their life-changing connection. We see how their lives begin to veer in very opposite directions, one toward work and marriage and the other toward reclusive scholarship, even as emotionally they stay deeply intertwined. And that's all I'll say for now. This book goes places. If we're going to dive in, we're going to talk about it more. But Joumana, Emily, Greg, have I missed anything? Anything you want to add to that synopsis?
Sounds pretty inviting.
I hope so. I found it to be pretty inviting. But before we dive in, I want to start off with 2 admin notes. 1, the core of this conversation will be anchored to My Brilliant Friend, the first book in the series, and there may be spoilers for that book in this conversation. And that leads me to book number 2. Though we're primarily talking about book number 1, we may reference some later books in the series, and so there may be some slight spoilers about later books too. We'll try to keep that to a minimum, but like Leela and Lenù, everyone's intertwined, so there may be spoilers, just general spoiler alert. And with that, let's dive in. Instead of my usual setup question, I will get to that in a little bit, but I just want to ask everyone on the table, where are you on the Ferrante train? Is this your first time reading her? Are you like a long-time loyal follower, reader? Like, where are you? I'm going to start with you first, Joumana.
Yeah, unsurprisingly, I'm an Elena Ferrante near completionist. I think I'm missing, I might be missing some essays or columns, but I've read every book that's available in English.
Got it. So you're our expert. I feel like every time you're on the podcast, we're like, you're our expert in blank.
Yeah,
You're
no pressure. Yeah.
You're a completionist for so many different authors.
I'm very choosy about them. And Ferrante might be the one who's published the most of my completionist writers, so I can't take that much credit.
Well, I'm going to put you in the position of expert. What about you, Emily?
I am not a Ferrante completist, but I have read My Brilliant Friend twice now, and I haven't even completed the whole series. And I'll confess that I did not vote for My Brilliant Friend as one of the top books of the 21st century so far, but I think it's a worthy choice. I'm a fan. I respect this book. I admire it. I can't wait to talk about it.
Incredible. And what about you, Greg?
I fall somewhere in between Joumana and Emily. I have read all of the Neapolitan series. I've also read The Days of Abandonment, a very short novel that she wrote, I think, before the Neapolitan series. And unlike Joumana, I have read that collection of columns and essays.
Well, I have read Frantumalia, but I'm just leaving open the possibility that I've missed a column or two.
Oh, okay. All right. So Joumana, as always, has me beat here.
No.
So we have a range. I have to say, this was my first time reading this book, and this is the first and only Ferrante book I've read. And I had a weird experience, which is I could have sworn until this read through that I had read at least My Brilliant Friend. And like maybe I just absorbed it through the zeitgeist and there were like plot beats that I just knew. And then I sat to read and I was surprised by a lot. And I was like, wait a second, I haven't read this before. So I went in thinking like, oh, this is my refresher read. And it was me discovering everything anew. And I was delighted by it. But speaking of that, like I was delighted by it. Now I want to do our general opening question, our temperature check. How did you feel about this book? Love it, hate it, have other thoughts? I just want to start big picture, top level. How did you feel? I'm going to start with you, Greg.
I loved it. As I said, I read all 4 of the Neapolitan novels, and I read them after the last one was published so that I could read them straight through. And that's what I did. I read the first one, and I just moved right on and picked up the second one, and I moved right on and picked up the third one. I mean, it's probably almost 10 years now since all 4 have been available, and I haven't gone back to reread them until I knew that we were going to do this book club when I refreshed my memory of My Brilliant Friend. And so the memory that I have of this series is a cumulative memory, and it's long enough ago now that it's sort of an atmospheric memory. I have things that I took away from it without really remembering specifics, and I was struck when you mentioned the framing device that opens this book with Leela's son calling Lenù to tell her that Leela had gone missing, because I had forgotten that until I went back to refresh my memory. And you would think, one half of this key friendship is missing as the series opens, and yet it's not what stuck with me. What stuck with me was that these dolls are missing throughout this book.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, like Ferrante is like the way she drills into certain details and the way these like very ordinary things become larger than life, larger than this missing person's plot.
Yeah.
But speaking of, can I just read that opening? Because I think it is a masterclass of immersion and tension in just a few sentences. The opening is, "This morning, Reno telephoned. I thought he wanted money again, and I was ready to say no. But that was not the reason for the phone call. His mother was gone. Since when? Since 2 weeks ago. Like for me, every single beat, the telephone, he wanted money again, so that already teases a relationship. He was ready to say no. Then you find out that the mother is gone, and then you find out that it's been longer than expected. I thought, for me, that is an incredible opening like sentence. I'm already in. And then to know that like details like the doll are actually what stands out.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I'm going to throw it over to you, Emily. What are your general thoughts?
Well, I want to respond to what you've just said, reading that opening, because I think one of the striking things about this book, which I found on a second read utterly engrossing as the first read, actually, I couldn't put it down, is the efficiency of the world building. She plunges you, as you say, it's in media res. You open that first page, you read that first sentence, and you're in the middle of a plot. And I think we need to drill down on this technique, because if you've read reviews of the book or you've read the book, many, many readers respond to it this way and evoke its spellbinding, hypnotic, mesmerizing qualities. And I think we expert readers can help illuminate just how she achieves that effect which I think I've read that she, and Joumana will know more about this, tends to cut pages from her books because they're too explanatory. She said she wants actually to create that kind of immediacy and vividness, and there's not a lot of time spent on exposition.
Interesting. I have to ask you, though, you've read this twice and you used the words hypnotic, especially for the first reading. Was it just as entrancing the second time around for you?
Absolutely. As I say, like, she's an incredibly evocative storyteller who plunges you into her world without spending a lot of time on explaining differences between the world of the reader that she assumes you inhabit and this world, this very particular world of 1950s Naples.
That setting is so rich, and we're going to dive in more. But first, I'm going to go over to you, Joumana. What are your top-level general thoughts about this book?
Oh, okay. Well, first I'm going to be a bit of a curmudgeon and just reaffirm my belief that all 4 books actually comprise one long novel. So even though we're only focusing on the first installment, I reread the whole series kind of like Greg, 1 through 4 in the last couple of weeks in preparation for this podcast.
Wait, can I pause real quick? You read them all through before.
Yeah.
And then you reread the entire series, not just the first book, which is what I did for this podcast. This is why you're our expert.
I know. This is why I'm turning into the podcast pick me girl, which is my worst nightmare.
Oh my God, that is not true, Joumana.
But anyway, back to Ferrante. One of the things that struck me when I was rereading this was just how easily Ferrante is able to access the mind and life of a child, like a really precocious child, and how wonderful it is to inhabit that, and also kind of how frightening, right? I mean, the scenario where Lenù and Lila are growing up, it's violent, it's dirty, it's scary, it's not governed by any kind of rational order, and for her, Lenù is writing about this decades later. She's in her 60s when she starts writing this book, and she's still able to summon the experience of being a child without laboring it, or without.
There's not a lot of self-conscious reflection, right? There's a very matter-of-fact presentation of this world.
Exactly. And that's, I think, what makes it so immediate and so engrossing, to use Emily's word.
Interesting. So I guess my general thought is we kind of got at it a little bit with the word hypnotic, but a lot of readers have glommed onto this book. They love this book. Again, it was voted the best book of the 21st century so far. It is remarkable, I think a lot of readers would say. And I'm curious, what about this book, this series, is connecting with people? Because a lot of books kind of take you back to Italy in the 50s. We actually just finished The Talented Mr. Ripley, for instance. A lot of books capture dynamic friendships. So what is it about specifically what Ferrante is up to that you think is touching readers? I'm going to throw it to you, Greg.
One thing that makes these books as propulsive as they are is, Emily described the in media res, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the prose style, which is not traditionally lyrical at all. That's not like beautiful language. She doesn't set up a lot of kind of striking imagery or musicality in the writing, but it is propulsive and fevered. It drives you forward with characterization and with plot. But the language itself, she falls back reliably on comma splices and run-on sentences in a way that pulls you right through. One sentence leads to the next without even a period to break them up. And it's not elegant, but it's very effective in creating this kind of hypnotic tone.
And it also, I think it's a good vehicle for a lot of Ferrante's subject matter, which is emotional overwhelm. I think that throughout the series, you see almost every single character grapple with his or her internal desires, emotions, and trying to put order on them. I don't necessarily want to say that they're in opposition in this world, because I think that Ferrante doesn't believe that emotion and reason are oppositional. But I think that when you see these passages that Greg pointed out, I'm so glad somebody else said comma splice, because that's what I was thinking about before we came down here. I think it's also it's a legible experience of emotional overwhelm. Like when Leela has her first episode of dissolving boundaries, that's like the closest way to replicate that experience on the page.
I think there's a valid reading of the book where you can see Lenù and Lila as just two sides of the same coin and as alter egos. And that the book as a whole, the 4 books together, are the kind of a sliding doors type story where you're looking at one version of the story where the character stays in Naples and one version of the story where the character escapes. Those who leave and those who stay. And that so she's saying, if I had stayed, I would have been Leela here, but I got out, and so I'm Lenù here. But then on the other hand, they're so individual and so specific in their characters that you also have to read it both ways at once and let the boundaries dissolve in the way that Lenù tells us happens to Leela in her perceptions of reality.
Interesting.
I think we should pause on that. And for readers who may not remember the book or haven't read it at all, to evoke their differences and similarities, because she really is playing with doubleness all the time and with opposition in these characters.
Yeah, lead us along. Tell us more. Tell us more about what you noticed, what you're thinking about.
Well, so Leela and Lenù meet in primary school, and they're immediately, Lenu's our narrator. And obviously she, telling the story, is talking about her attraction to this girl who is ostensibly her opposite. She's effortlessly brilliant. She's skinny. She's dark. Lenù is, I think, blonde and tends toward plumpness, is the good girl, the try hard.
The pick me.
Pick me. And so you get this kind of portrait of opposites. But of course, they start to Lenù is obsessed with Leela and identifies with her and talks about how Leela figures inside her. She internalizes Leela, starts to imitate her. For our readers who are on TikTok, and that does not include me, Leela is brat. And Lenù is demure.
Okay, I don't believe that's not you, because that was like such an on-point reference. That's hilarious.
I have a teenager in the house.
I can't get over Leela's brat. I'm sorry.
But there's this way in which this novel sets up both this kind of archetypal relationship while also setting up something very individual in particular. And I find that fascinating. It's a fairy tale, but it's also a story rooted in the granular reality of impoverished Naples in the 50s.
Can I just say about that duality? This book really resonated with me as a twin. Like, I know this relationship so well, which is to be like of someone and also an individual. And there's a way, where you're like, can I tell a silly story that's going to reveal quite a lot about myself?
Please.
Flashback to MJ graduating the 8th grade. I was so overwhelmed about the idea of starting high school. I was like, I'm not ready. I'm so scared. Similar to how these girls are like scared and eager, though, to go to the next level. I got a C in math. I was devastated. I was like, I am stupid. I am not ready. It was like one of the first C's I've ever gotten. And my brother did better. And then I was really stressed when we were taking our high school placement exams. And so my brother got into honors English and I got into standard. And I was just like so happy for him and also so devastated for myself, not because I was like, Mark shouldn't have what he's gotten, but because I was like, I'm being left behind. And like, we are the same, even though we're separate. And just that tension of being like, I want to be my own person, but I don't want to be left behind. But I also want to carve out my own path. But also I'm excited for them, but also their success. I am like competitively driving, pushing forward. Like, there's a way. I have never been a teenage girl in 1950s Naples, but I do understand so intimately that dynamic. And I think it's more than a sibling dynamic too. There's like this kindred, two sides of the same coin, like dynamic there that I felt was so rich. And I think the success of this book is how it brings readers into that. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that it made me think of books like Little Women, books where like you identify yourself with a type. I feel like this book, you're either Leela or Lenù. You're brat or you're demure. You're like, there's a way that you deeply identify with certain types of characters. And yet these characters are so complicated that like, it kind of complicates easy categorization for each person.
One of the things about these women, these girls, is that from the jump, their contradictions are apparent, right? So we think of Leela as being the sort of fearless one. She's the one who's throwing rocks at boys and, the like Neapolitan equivalent of kindergarten. And yet she's the one, when she and Lenù play hooky, they want to walk to the sea. They grow up in Naples, for God's sake. And Leela's the one who freaks out when she can't see the neighborhood anymore. And she's the one that brings them back.
They're both archetypes, but they don't stick to prescribed definitions. So the dynamic is very unstable, as all relationships are. And you hear readers saying, wow, she writes about friendship in a way that's honest. It's the unvarnished truth about female friendships. There's hate and hostility. And in fact, the book begins with, let's see who wins, right? This time. So it begins in a state of anger and with a desire for vengeance. And I think that's what Joumana is saying. I think that there's all of these emotions constantly being interchanged.
One thing I love about that, with it opening as an act of vengeance, it's the writing itself is the act of vengeance. It's the, I'm not going to let her disappear. I'm going to recreate her. And the fact that I forgot that she disappears means, who wins is the writer.
And two, I mean, when is the last time that you read 4 books in a sequence that are powered by anger, right? Like women's anger specifically, And I think like in all of Ferrante's books, the creative act is almost always an expression of anger or some kind of original wound in that way. And I think that's an emotion that a lot of people shy away from when we talk about, women's expression of whatever. And instead, this becomes this sort of brilliant exploration of your emotional topography.
But how subtle is that anger too? Again, like it is driven by anger. And yet for us, like for me, the emotion that I felt was love here. Like love of someone who has gotten away, love of someone who is your flesh and blood, basically. There's a complicated subtlety and intertwining there.
There's also competitiveness. Lenù wants to be able to write with the effortless fluency that comes to Leela, who lacks Lenù's education. And she says there are very few places in the book where Lenù becomes self-conscious or tells us about her desire to write. And so they're very striking, and I noted them when they appeared. And she says at one point about Leela's uncanny ability with prose. She took the facts and in a natural way charged them with tension. She intensified reality as she reduced it to words. That is what Lenù wants to do, and that is what Ferrante arguably is doing in this series.
Interesting. Greg, you look like you were about to say something off of that too.
I was going to say something off of that. First, I was going to circle back to the idea of the characters as two sides of the same coin and point out, say it's worth noting their names, which are fairly similar, Leela and Lenù, aren't even their real names. And so they're living in this world that they have created. Lenù is really Elena, the author's pseudonym. So right away, you're playing with kind of invented names at every level there. And Leela's real name is Raffaella. So they're names that they give each other. And Lenù, Leela's doll that goes missing at the beginning, along with Lenù's doll, Leela's doll is named Nu. And so it's Lenù and Nu. It's this idea that Lenù is Leela's doll or plaything throughout. What I was going to say about the idea of competition is Lenù is the friend who has advantages, who has opportunities, but she always feels herself lesser than Leela. And so there's a constant striving to prove herself worthy of the advantages that are handed to her and to make good according to what Leela would have done had she had those advantages, and a constant sense that she's not living up to that. And it drives her personality kind of throughout the 4 books. I mean, so you think this is why she's a writer. She's trying to do what Leela would have done.
Interestingly, I think throughout a lot of it, like when you see Lenù has submitted some writing and she notes like, oh, I workshopped this with Leela, or I was trying to find Leela's voice but make it my own. There's a way that they're competing through each other, with each other, for each other, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. I love all of this. I am like just very happy with this discussion right now, and we're going to dive into more, but first I think we should take a quick break. And we're back. This is the Book Review Podcast. I'm MJ Franklin. I'm joined by Joumana Khatib, Greg Cowles, and Emily Eakin, and we're discussing My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. So this is a book club in the studio, but then also online, and we got a lot of reader comments in our discussion article for this book club. So we wanted to go through and share some of those reader observations and respond to some. David from New York writes, I recently started the first volume. I'm curious about the translation. In translation, the writing style seems to be purposefully brutalist, inelegant, awkward, ungrammatical. I assume the translation reflects the deliberate style of the author. This is not a criticism. I've grown to like the style, and I understand why it might accurately reflect the novel's milieu, but I am curious to know whether the translation accurately reflects Ferrante's Italian. Joumana, I don't know if you secretly speak Italian, but I do know that you've spoken with Ferrante's translator and Goldstein, so I'm going to throw this one over to you.
Yeah, I don't secretly or even not so secretly speak Italian, but I have been trying to study it bit by bit. And I have a real soft spot for translated literature and translators in general. So talking with Anne was a real revelation. And I mentioned this on an earlier podcast, so longtime listeners, I'm sorry that you're about to hear me repeat myself. But when I was working on that piece about Anne, I spoke with a lot of other Italian translators, people who actually auditioned to translate Ferrante. And the universal thought was that not only was Anne the best suited person to do it, but she actually made the books better in English. So people will say that, they're wonderful in Italian, but they're exquisite in English.
What is it about the English translation? What is it about Anne and her translation that seemed stand out?
I'm going to be summarizing that. I'm marshaling a chorus of admirers here, but I think one thing that's useful to know, sure, Greg is right about the comma splices and sort of the way that this is endemic to Ferrante's writing, the way that she really mounts emotion, wave after wave after wave, and you sort of have to submit to it as a reader. And you can see that on the page. I mean, there's so many pages where it's like an entire page is given over to a single thought or experience or wave. I think, too, you'll notice that particularly later in the series, this is after Lenù has left the neighborhood and has gone up north to study and to live, there will be moments when they're talking about having a conversation, and the book will say, so-and-so said in dialect. And I think that that's also important to remember the intricacies of translating the Neapolitan dialect versus straight Italian, which is something that if you're reading the Italian book, it's just, you see it on the page, but knowing that Anne had to sort of mediate basically two languages into an English translation and make sure that the connotations of that are delivered to the readers, it's impressive.
Ooh, the skill. And readers, if you want to know more about the work of translation, we did a big translation project. Maybe we'll link to it in the article page or in the show notes. But translation is often unseen and very important work. I have another question. I'm going to throw it over to you, Greg. This is from Louise from Melbourne, Australia. And Louise writes, I enjoyed learning about village life for poor girls growing up in Italy in the 50s, early 60s before TV arrived for them. The struggle of our protagonists as they try to be themselves in a world not ready for intelligent, headstrong women, and the choices they make still resonate for women today. I didn't love the story. However, I like that it managed to traverse important societal issues and perennial teenage woes woven so deftly into the story. I want to throw this over to you and Greg, ask, what do you think about the way this book has captured teenagehood? Huh. You have not been a teenage girl in Italy either in the 50s, but you have been a teenager. And then also as a parent, you've seen teenage years from the other side as
I am seeing them still.
And so I'm curious what you think about this book's portrait of teenagedom.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have not been a teenage girl in Naples in the 1950s. I have not been a twin either. But I think that the portrait of teenagerdom here through the vessel of friendship, I mean, this more than any of the books in the quartet is about friendship. And obviously the whole quartet is about friendship, but this one is My Brilliant Friend. And this sets up the friendship. And there are decades later in this series where they don't even talk to each other, where it's all just kind of a remembered friendship and the effect that that's had on forming who they are. But here we're in it, and we're in it because they're teenagers. Any great literature of friendship is a story of adolescence. So because when you're very young, your identity is your nuclear family. And as you grow into teenagerdom, before you hit the kind of the coming of age and romantic life, when your when your self-definition is defined by your romantic life, it's your friends. And so friendship in this book is all about teenagerdom, and it's how they come to a sense of self-identity by pushing against each other. You like this. Am I wrong to not like that? Am I right to like this? And it's so true to what teenagerdom is like, where you're figuring out who you are through your relationships with your friends, with another person.
There's a word that I always think about with like your teenage years and your adolescence, and that's the word hard wrought. Like, I feel like it's like you are forging yourself in the fires of a million hormones, but then also of like self-definition, stepping away from your nuclear family, finding friendship, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I want to throw it over to you two, Emily, Joumana. What did you think about this book's portrait of teenagedom and like teenage girlhood, et cetera, et cetera?
You see the shifting dynamic, this unstable aspect to relationships as you're growing up. And in cases where there's real animosity, the boys throw rocks at the girls, and then a few years later are wooing the girls and dating the girls. I think Reno actually beats up the man that Leela ends up marrying. And that she captures all of those shifting alliances, that tendency, that inevitability, I think so seamlessly and naturally.
One thing I think is really interesting is that we never have access to Leela's own point of view. So we don't know. She might be just as insecure as Lenù is. She might be measuring herself against Lenù and finding herself coming up short the way that we know Lenù does toward Leela.
And that's just another complicating, rich factor. I almost want to read a whole series written from Leela's perspective. And of course, there's the question of who is the brilliant friend. For most of the book, Lenù is like, Leela's my brilliant friend. She's the one that's been helping me with school, and she didn't get the opportunity. She's the reason why I'm kind of pushing myself. But we get that heartbreaking moment at the end of the book where Leela is getting married, and Lenù's like, eventually I will have to stop school. And Leela says to her, quote, "No, don't ever stop. I'll give you the money. You should keep studying." And then she says, "Not for you. You're my brilliant friend. You have to be the best of all, boys and girls." And so even though Lenù has been looking up to Leela all this time, you find out that like Leela has also been looking up to Lenù in this like kind of quick little moment.
Yeah.
And also, the one thing that's really stuck with me is that early on in the book, there's an example of Leela's writing. She puts together sort of a fable within a fable called The Blue Fairy that really made an impression on their school teacher. This is before Leela had to drop out of school. And years later, Lenù recovers it, and she brings it and she rereads it as an adult and is struck again by her friend's brilliance, just this kind of perfectly formed, wild intelligence on the page. And at this point, she brings it to Leela, who this is an adult, and Leela just scoffs at it. Lenù has this reverence for this document, and Leela's like, what does this even matter? And that's the only example that we have in the book. And we're so close to we never read the text, of course, and and it goes by the wayside.
They're both brilliant friends. Is the moral of this story.
They're the same person, as Greg says.
One of the things that was interesting to me is as the two girls are going through puberty, in a certain way, I won't say the power dynamics change, but all of a sudden, Lenù, who's usually the follower, hits puberty first, mm-hmm. and then she's in the lead, and she doesn't have Leela as like a guide anymore. And yet it's like this thing that she's both not competing for, but she's trying to say like, I was a woman first. But she knows that Leela has this thing that like this magnetic thing that not just boys, but like everyone kind of gravitates toward. And so she's kind of eagerly waiting for Leela to hit puberty too. And that also felt like such a specific teenage thing to me.
But don't forget, though, that Lenù's experience of puberty is pretty harrowing. You know, she puts on weight. She's self-conscious about the size of her bust. She's got acne.
She's sexually assaulted.
She's right. And she becomes sexualized and doesn't enjoy it. And then when Leela finally hits puberty, she's beautiful. I mean, she looks like a model. Even her ankles, for God's sake. I mean, like, she becomes this like unbelievable fetish object in a way that she kind of always was, because she was the town genius, the town menace. And then when you add the physical beauty to it too, then it becomes this sort of otherworldly, like, how can this feral child be this beautiful?
I'm laughing because I'm remembering one description, because there are not that many metaphors. Actually, she's not a metaphor-heavy writer, but one point Lenù describes Leela as a salted anchovy.
Wait, I have that written down too. So funny.
And then suddenly there she is at the beach in this gorgeous red bikini, and she's stunning.
I think it's really significant when Lenù hits puberty and it's this awkward time. Leela, who has not hit it, still wins the upper hand by giving her the advice on how to deal with boys. And suddenly all the other girls are turning to Leela for advice and attention. Before Leela has even hit puberty, she's the one who says, oh, here's what you do.
The scales, the needle is continually fluctuating.
Yeah.
I have another question. I'm going to throw it over to you, Emily. Another reader, Kristen from California, writes, I'm a super fan of the Neapolitan quartet. I have read through all of the books twice. I plan to start from the beginning again next summer. The thing that keeps me coming back to these novels is the understanding I get from Ferrante's depiction of the violence in Leela and Lenù's world. I'm the granddaughter of a Neapolitan family, and I am informed by this novel about what life was like for my ancestors. I understand more viscerally the violence and interpersonal relationships that my family members brought with them from Italy to America. I get a taste for the real quest to survive that has informed generations of my family members since. I want to ask you, Emily, can you tell me about this book's evocation of place and time? It really does immerse you in a scene and a setting, and I want to know what picture that is. Can you talk to me about the immersion and the setting of this novel?
I think that's a great question. And we touched a little bit on how little time Ferrante spends on exposition, on sort of self-consciously setting up a place. She plunges us into it. And I think one of the things that's remarkable is how this novel is a fable. I mean, at the beginning, most of the characters, and there is a large cast of characters, and readers have complained about having to flip to the beginning of the book to figure out, again, who's related to who. I mean, it's a series of families, and they all live in this sort of apartment complex around this courtyard. It's almost like a movie set, and it's sort of a microcosm of the neighborhood. So you get one family, the cobbler, one family, the porter's family, the grocer's family, the pipe fitter's family, the construction worker's family, the local mafioso, the Camorra Don's family. And so all of that has this kind of almost surreal fable-like aspect, but at the same time, it's incredibly particular and careful. And so she shows us that this is a world where no one has a TV. So the TV arrives, it's a very big deal, and people start coming over. It actually arrives at the cobbler's family's house. And so other people, neighbors, come over at night to watch it. And Lenù has never been to a restaurant until she's a teenager, and it's a very uncomfortable experience for her, you know. And I think that the way that the dialogue shifts from the dialect to Italian, that kind of code switching effect is also a kind of marker. All these things are markers of class, but markers of class in this neighborhood. So you used Italian only in very proper settings when you wanted to kind of impress someone, show a kind of extra deference or respect. And I'm sure Anne Goldstein thought about these decisions very carefully, but to leave in words like the stradone, the main road, which becomes a marker of kind of the boundaries of this very specific neighborhood that's both archetypal and a fable, and also this kind of deeply, vividly rendered portrait of 1950s working class Naples.
Yeah, I completely agree. And the word that keeps coming to mind is precise. She lights on like the exact precise detail so that she can paint this portrait without kind of getting in the way of like the deep interiority. It never feels like, okay, now flash to scene setting. It feels so seamless because of the specific details that she lights on.
Can I use this as an opportunity? So obviously this is the elephant in the room, but, of course there's still a mystery around who Elena Ferrante really is.
It's you, right?
Yeah, no, yeah. Thanks for listening.
Now we know.
Readers don't tell. Okay? Just between us.
Yes, play this podcast backwards and we'll tell you who it actually is. This is a whole separate discussion because Ferrante is a pseudonym that the author has used since she began publishing 30 plus years ago. And there are all sorts of questions about whether it's Anita Raja or the novelist Domenico Starnone. And then it turns into this whole mess, right? Because people say, Ferrante wants to be private, like let her have her privacy. It actually doesn't matter who she is or what her biography is and all that. That being said, there is a pretty strong contingency of readers who feel invested in the idea that Ferrante herself is a woman from Naples who grew up around the same time as these characters. Ferrante has written a little bit about her biography in some of her nonfiction where she said, I'm a woman, I'm from Naples, I know this intimately. People have called that into question. But it's interesting how much people still scour these books for signs of autobiography or autofiction or firsthand knowledge.
Am I correct in thinking a journalist, I think an Italian journalist, did this investigation and claims to have figured out using sort of income and tax forms, Ferrante's identity. And a lot of people responded with, don't tell us. I don't want to know. You're ruining it, which I think is fascinating. I can't think of another case where people weren't eager to actually know, quote unquote, the truth.
Shakespeare is the other case.
Ferrante and Will.
Yeah. I think people do have a parasocial relationship with Ferrante characters, but for whatever reason, it's not our job. I think journalists are driven by something entirely different than civilian readers. So I don't think it's our place to say whether or not we should be uncovering it.
We are nosy by trade. It is our jobs to figure things out.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, I feel like we can answer questions all day long. And there are so many questions that are wonderful. So one, I just want to say thank you to all of our readers who commented and left observations. Please continue. And then for anyone who's not jumped in the comment section, join the conversation. It's delightful. Our second segment is inspired by this really deep relationship with Leela and Lenù. We wanted to recommend other books about friendship that we love. And I'm going to leave it there to keep it broad and ambiguous and open. But I just want to know, what are other books about friendship that readers should check out? I'm going to start with you, Joumana.
This is going to shock you all, especially Greg. I'm going to recommend a book by Dana Spiotta. It's the first one that came to mind, not only because I love her, but because I think it will scratch a similar itch. And the book that I'm thinking of is called Innocence and Others. This is about a similar female friendship. This time it starts in Los Angeles, and it follows these women through their careers. There's Meadow, who's sort of a little wealthier, and she ends up having an affair with somebody that we're led to believe is Orson Welles, and then becomes sort of this indie filmmaker of her own renown. And then there's Carrie, who mostly does romantic comedies, and then they get implicated in each other's work, and they have distinct aesthetics, and yet they're very aligned, and there are traces of each other in each other's work. It's a short book. Somehow she packs all this in, and it felt like it could have been Ferrante in America, which feels like a big jump, but I'm going to stand by that.
I love this recommendation. Yeah. I know I haven't read any Dana Spiotta, but I will fix that. And I know Wayward was huge a few years ago.
Yeah. Dana Spiotta is another one of my completionist projects, but Dana's only written 5 books, so I really can't brag that much.
Perfect. Well, readers, go check that out. What about you, Emily? What's a book about friendship that you love?
This is one I actually thought maybe Joumana would mention. It is Inseparable by Simone de Beauvoir, which is a novelized memoir written in the 50s, I think around 1954, but published only posthumously, about Beauvoir's childhood friendship with Elizabeth Lacoin, who was known as Zaza, whom she met in primary school. And their friendship had a very Leela, Lenù aspect to it. Zaza was effortlessly brilliant. She lives in a kind of big, rich Catholic family and is allowed, very permissive family, allowed to do all kinds of things that Simone de Beauvoir is not allowed to do. And it's a beautiful, tender homage to this friendship that ended tragically when Zaza died at the age of 21, I think from viral encephalitis or something. And apparently Sartre read the manuscript in the 50s and said, no, this is not publishable. And I recall that our reviewer, because the book was translated into English a few years ago and published, and our reviewer speculated that Sartre was just jealous. He was floored to discover that the formative relationship in Simone de Beauvoir's life was not with him.
Can I just say, I, one, love that recommendation, and then two, love that you, Emily, have taken us from Brat to Simone de Beauvoir. That is range. What about you, Greg? What's a book about friendship that you love?
Can I do two?
Of course.
This
is a book review podcast. The more books, the better.
I'm going to recommend two books published 20 years apart. One is a memoir, one is a novel. The novel is Jonathan Letham's novel, The Fortress of Solitude from 2003. It tells the story of two friends, one named Dylan, one named Mingus, growing up in Brooklyn in the 1970s. They get together over a love of music and kind of nerd culture. There's a lot of science fiction and comic books. The Fortress of Solitude, the title of the book, is a reference to Superman's place where he retreats to kind of recharge himself. Dylan is white, Mingus is black. Dylan goes on to college and success. Mingus goes on to prison. And so there's a lot about race relations and politics, really a lot about nerd culture and music, which leads me to my second recommendation, which is Wasu's Stay True, published in 2023, a memoir of his friendship in college with a friend over music and nerd culture as well.
And that was best book of the year when it came out.
Yes, it was.
One of my favorite books about friendship is The Rachel Incident by Caroline O'Donoghue. This is a contemporary Irish novel about the friendship between a young woman and a gay man. They meet at a bookstore where they're both working, and their lives just become like immediately intertwined. I don't want to spoil what happens, but there are hijinks and affairs and attempts to escape where they're from and all of that stuff. For me, the reason why I love it is that it captures a thing that I think is so important for a book about friendship, and that is the word chemistry. I don't want to just see the effects of a pivotal friendship, but I feel like I need to believe these two people would actually be drawn together. And I've read a lot of books about friendship where you see like, oh yeah, like they were next to each other and they were doing all of these things together, but like I want to feel that same kind of magnetic pull from each person as individuals, and thus like kind of feel why these two people are drawn together. And that's what this book captures. I feel like I was just so there in their friendship that in the Rachel incident that anything could happen, and I'd just be excited to see how these two people riff off of each other. We have time for a lightning round. Any other titles you want to flash through, want to mention?
I'll mention A Separate Piece by John Knowles, which is just a beautiful book. It's the kind of book I think that used to be assigned in high school English classes, probably not anymore for PC reasons. I don't know what's not PC about the book. But anyway, it's about a rivalrous friendship between two young men, and it's told in retrospect by one of the men, the survivor of the friendship, who returns to the boarding school where he met his friend, Phineas. His name is Gene, and he relives their relationship. Now, Phineas was this golden boy, this kind of preternaturally talented athlete, and Gene was jealous and admiring at the same time, and impulsively commits an act that leads Phineas to be gravely injured and contributes ultimately to his death. And so he returns to this school bearing a lot of guilt. And in the backdrop is World War II. This is the boarding school events take place during the war. It's a beautiful book.
Love that. And I'm going to flash through one title too, and that is In Memoriam by Alice Wynne. This is a complicated friendship set during World War I, I believe, but then also the friendship turns into a romance, which is my kind of favorite friendship. Anyway, it's just a remarkable book. It's similar. Like, I got the chemistry. You want these two characters to be together. I feel like it's kind of cheating to call it a book about friendship because it is clearly so much more. But when the book starts, they are friends in a boarding school. And so I'm going to lump it in just because I want more people to read this book. I think it's remarkable.
I can also talk quickly about Hisham Mattar's book, My Friends, long listed for the Booker. Unlike the other ones that we've mentioned, this is actually about 3 friends. Ooh. For a little, extra spice. But that's another great one.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. I just want to say, Emily, Joumana, Greg, thank you so much. This was so much fun.
Thank you, MJ.
Thanks, MJ.
Thank you, MJ.
And I want to say a big thank you to our readers and listeners for writing in and sharing your thoughts about this book for us. Please keep the conversation going. We have an article page up on the New York Times website, headline Book Club, Read My Brilliant Friend with the Book Review. It's where we announced that this would be our August book club pick. Continue to share your thoughts there and talk with each other. That conversation is robust and delightful. Also, before we go, I want to reveal our next book club selection. In September, we'll be discussing The Hypocrite by Joe Hamya. That episode will air on September 27th. We'll hope you join us. We hope you'll discuss the book with us. And in the meantime, happy reading.
That was MJ Franklin in conversation with Greg Cowles, Emily Eakin, and Joumana Khatib about My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. I hope you've had a great summer. Thanks for listening.